2025, 47 of prisoners across the United States faced the ultimate punishment. While some executions were delayed or suspended, others were carried out in 9 different states. In this video, we examine the crimes that placed these individuals on death row, the final meals they chose or refused, and the last words they spoke before their executions. These are the most disturbing and unforgettable cases of the year. Before we dive in, after hearing these cases, do you believe people sentenced to death should be shown mercy and given the chance to change? Or should the punishment remain final? Why do you think so? Welcome to Criminal Profiles. 1. Marion Bowman Jr. State, South Carolina. Age, 44. Year of arrest, 2002. Year of execution, 2025. The story of Marion Bowman Jr. does not begin with a confession or a smoking gun. It begins with a body, burned, hidden, and abandoned, and a case built almost entirely on the words of others. In 2001, 21-year-old Candy Martin disappeared. Days later, her charred body was found inside the trunk of a car, a discovery that shocked Dorchester County and ignited a desperate search for answers. There was no forensic evidence directly tying Bowman to the killing, no DNA, no eyewitness to the act itself. What investigators had instead were people who knew him, friends, associates, and relatives, each offering pieces of a story. Those witnesses became the backbone of the prosecution. Some testified after receiving reduced charges or plea deals, a fact Bowman's defense would later argue compromised the integrity of their statements. Prosecutors, however, told jurors these were insiders who knew the truth, people finally willing to speak after a brutal crime. Bowman was arrested in 2002 and ultimately convicted of murder. From the beginning, he maintained his innocence, insisting he did not kill Candy Martin. That claim never changed, not during trial, not during appeals, and not even as his execution date approached. On the day of his execution in January 2025, Bowman requested an elaborate final meal: fried seafood, chicken wings, onion rings, banana pudding, German chocolate cake, and fruit juice. A final moment of choice in a life that had long lost control. When asked for his final words, Bowman did not apologize. He did not confess. Instead, he returned to the same statement he had made for over 2 decades. "I did not kill Candy Martin." Minutes later, South Carolina carried out his execution, closing a case that still leaves a lingering question behind. Was justice served, or was certainty never truly achieved? 2. Stephen LaWayne Nelson. State, Texas. Age, 37. Year of arrest, 2011. Year of execution, 2025. Stephen LaWayne Nelson's crime did not happen in the dead of night. It happened in the middle of the day, inside a church, where no one expected violence to walk through the door. On March 3, 2011, Nelson entered North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas, not to pray, but to steal. Inside the church office, he encountered Clint Dobson, a 28-year-old associate pastor who was working alone. What followed was not a struggle that got out of hand. It was a sustained, brutal attack. Prosecutors said Nelson beat Dobson and strangled him, leaving him dying on the floor. As Dobson lay helpless, Nelson continued moving through the church, gathering electronics and valuables. Then the second tragedy unfolded. Susie Jackson, a 67-year-old church secretary, arrived for work, unaware she was stepping into an active crime scene. She never left alive. Nelson attacked her as well, killing her inside the same building meant to offer refuge and faith. This was not a circumstantial case. Surveillance footage, fingerprints, stolen property, and Nelson's own presence tied him directly to the murders. He was arrested the same day. At trial, the jury found him guilty of capital murder for killing 2 people during a robbery. As his execution approached in February 2025, one detail stood out. Texas does not allow special last meals. Nelson was served the standard prison meal, with no choice and no ceremony. In his final moments, Nelson spoke calmly. He addressed his wife, telling her to enjoy life. He told witnesses he was not afraid. And just before the lethal injection began, he looked toward the warden and said, "Let's ride, warden." Minutes later, the execution was carried out. closing a case that began with theft and ended with 2 lives lost inside a church. 3. Demetrius Terrence Frasier, State, Alabama, age 52, year of arrest, 1992, year of execution, 2025. Some criminals spend years in custody waiting for justice. Others spend decades. But Demetrius Terrence Frasier waited more than 3 decades before Alabama finally carried out his sentence. And even then, the method was as unusual as the length of his wait. In late 1991, then 19-year-old Frasier broke into the apartment of 41-year-old Pauline Brown in Birmingham, Alabama. Prosecutors said he asked for money, then raped her at gunpoint and shot her in the head when she begged for her life. But that was not the only murder connected to his violent past. While in Michigan custody, Frasier confessed to killing 14-year-old Crystal Kendrick in 1992, a crime for which he received life sentences before being transferred to Alabama to face the death penalty. A jury in Alabama convicted him of capital murder in 1996, and he sat on death row for decades, the legal wheels of appeals grinding slowly while families waited for closure. In 2025, Alabama scheduled his execution by nitrogen hypoxia, a controversial method that replaces oxygen with pure nitrogen to cause death by asphyxiation. Frasier was the 4th person in the U.S. executed using this method. On February 6, 2025, at the William C. Holman Correctional Facility, Frasier was pronounced dead at 6:36 p.m. after nitrogen gas was administered. Witnesses noted that he struggled briefly as the process began. Last meal, Frasier's final meal was ordered from Taco Bell and included a beefy 5-layer burrito, a chicken chalupa supreme, beef crunchy tacos, chips and dip, and a Mountain Dew. In his final statement, Frasier apologized to the friends and family of Pauline Brown, saying, "What happened to Pauline Brown should have never happened." He also expressed love for others on death row and referenced his hometown with "Detroit Strong." His last recorded phrase as the execution began was, "Let's go." 4. James Dennis Ford, State, Florida, age 64, year of arrest, 1997, year of execution, 2025. The day began like any other for Gregory and Kimberly Malnery, a couple from Charlotte County, Florida, who were looking forward to a quiet fishing trip on a remote sod farm in April 1997. Their toddler daughter, 22-month-old Miranda, rode along in the pickup truck's back seat, strapped in and expecting nothing more than a day outdoors. Police later said that James Dennis Ford, a co-worker of Gregory, invited the couple on the trip, and then turned it into a nightmare. Court records and prosecutors' testimony show Ford first shot Gregory in the back of the head with a .22 caliber rifle, beat him with a blunt instrument and slit his throat. When Kimberly tried to shield her daughter, Ford beat her, sexually assaulted her, and then shot her as well. Workers would find Miranda 18 hours later, still strapped in her seat, dehydrated, covered in blood and insect bites. Ford was arrested and convicted in 1999 on multiple charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, sexual battery, and child abuse. Despite numerous appeals, including arguments that he had a low IQ at the time of the crime, courts, up to the U.S. Supreme Court, refused to block his death sentence. On February 13, 2025, James Dennis Ford became Florida's first execution of the year when the state put him to death by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He was pronounced dead at 6:19 p.m. as about 25 witnesses looked on. Last meal, Ford requested steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea as his final meal. Final words. Ford declined to speak at the execution, giving no verbal final words before the lethal drugs were administered. However, he left a brief written message that read, "Hugs, prayer, love. God bless everyone." 5. Richard Lee Tabler, State, Texas, age 46, year of arrest, 2004, arrest and murders, year of execution, 2025. Richard Lee Tabler's case was more than a homicide. It was a 2-day calculated killing spree that began with revenge and ended in decades of legal battles, remorse, and repeated attempts to control his own fate. In November 2004, Tabler, then living in Killeen, Texas, became embroiled in a bitter conflict with his former boss at a strip club, 28-year-old Mohammed Amin Ramouni. Tensions escalated into what prosecutors characterized as a plan of retaliation. On November 26th, Tabler lured Ramouni and his friend Haitham Zayed, 25, to a parking lot under the pretense of selling stereo equipment. Once there, he shot both men at close range, then pulled Ramouni from the car and shot him again. 2 days later, Tabler confessed to killing 2 teenage women, 18-year-old Tiffany Dotson and 16-year-old Amanda Benefield, who worked at the same club, though he was never tried for those murders. Investigators said he feared they would expose his role in the earlier killings. Tabler was charged and convicted of capital murder for the deaths of Ramouni and Zayed, and in 2007 a Texas jury sentenced him to death. For years on death row, Tabler's path twisted. He alternated between seeking to drop his appeals and then fighting to stay alive, and even made headlines in 2008 when he smuggled a cell phone into prison and made death threats against a state lawmaker, triggering a massive lockdown. On February 13, 2025, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice carried out Tabler's lethal injection at the Huntsville unit, and he was pronounced dead at about 6:38 p.m. CST. Last meal. There is no publicly reported or confirmed special last meal for Richard Lee Tabler. Final words. According to official records from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and Execution coverage, Tabler's final statement included a heartfelt apology and plea for forgiveness. "There is not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions. I had no right to take your loved ones from you, and I ask and pray, hope and pray that one day you find it in your hearts to forgive me for those actions. No amount of my apologies will ever return them to you." Richard Lee Tabler, final statement before lethal injection. He also expressed love and gratitude to his family, friends, and supporters, thanked prison staff for their compassion, and told the warden, "I am finished." Witness reports note that as the lethal drugs took effect, he mouthed, "I'm sorry," one last time. 6. Brad Keith Sigman. State, South Carolina. Age, 67 year of arrest, 2001. Year of execution, 2025. Brad Keith Sigman's crime was stark in its brutality, but tragic in the personal wounds that preceded it. On April 27, 2001, Sigman, then 43, went to the home of his former girlfriend's parents, William David Lark, 62, and Gladys Gwendolyn Lark, 59, in Greenville County. According to court records and reporting, Sigman was reeling from the end of his romantic relationship and, fueled by anger and distress, beat both victims repeatedly with a baseball bat, leaving them dead inside their home. Following the killings, Sigman kidnapped his ex-girlfriend, but she escaped and later identified him as her attackers. He was later captured in Tennessee after an 11-day manhunt. He was convicted in 2002 of 2 counts of murder and 1 count of burglary, and sentenced to death. Sigman's execution in 2025 carried additional historical weight. He was not only the oldest person executed in South Carolina, but also the first in nearly 15 years in the United States to be executed by firing squad, a method reauthorized by state law in response to drug shortages and legal controversies around lethal injection. On March 7, 2025, at the Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, Sigman was strapped to a chair with a target over his heart, and 3 volunteer prison employees fired rifles at him. He was pronounced dead at 6:08 p.m. EST after the bullets hit the target area. Last meal. Before his execution, Sigman requested a substantial meal from Kentucky Fried Chicken, including fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea, a request that was served and shared with fellow inmates before his death. Final words. Sigman's final statement was a religious and moral appeal, urging Christians to work toward ending the death penalty. His attorney read the words aloud to witnesses, which included family of the victims and his spiritual advisor. Among the sentiments he expressed were, "I want my closing statement to be one of love and a calling to my fellow Christians to help us end the death penalty." He continued by contrasting Old Testament eye for an eye justice with New Testament teachings of mercy and forgiveness, arguing that modern society should not take life as retribution, 7. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. State, Louisiana. Age, 46. Year of arrest, 1996. Year of execution, 2025. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr.'s case marked a turning point in Louisiana's history, not because of who he was, but because of what the state chose to do after 15 years without an execution. In 1996, Hoffman was just 18 years old when he crossed paths with Mary Molly Elliott, a 28-year-old advertising executive in New Orleans. Prosecutors said Hoffman kidnapped Elliott at gunpoint, forced her to withdraw money from ATMs, and later raped and murdered her, abandoning her body in St. Tammany Parish. The crime shocked the region, not only for its brutality, but for the calculated steps taken before her death. Hoffman was arrested the same year and later convicted of kidnapping, rape, and first-degree murder. In 1998, a jury sentenced him to death. What followed was nearly 3 decades on death row, during which Louisiana carried out no executions at all. His case lingered as appeals moved slowly through the courts while the state debated methods, legality, and morality. That silence ended on March 18, 2025. Louisiana chose to execute Hoffman using nitrogen hypoxia, becoming the first state since Alabama to use the method and the first execution in Louisiana in 15 years. Witnesses described the execution lasting about 19 minutes, during which Hoffman showed involuntary movements as oxygen was displaced from his body. In the hours before his execution, Hoffman made no final requests. He declined a last meal. He declined to give any final spoken words. There was no apology read aloud, no final statement to the victim's family, no declaration of innocence or guilt, only silence. At 6:50 p.m., he was pronounced dead at the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, closing a case that reopened the state's use of capital punishment and reignited national debate over execution methods. 8. Aaron Brian Gunches, State, Arizona. Age, 53. Year of arrest, 2003. Year of execution, 2025. Aaron Brian Gunches' path to execution was unusual in one stark way. He actively sought his own death sentence. The crime that led him there occurred on November 14, 2002, near Mesa, Arizona, in a case driven by jealousy, alcohol, and a volatile relationship. Investigators say Gunches found his girlfriend injured after a fight with her ex-husband, 40-year-old Ted Price. Seeing Price dazed and wounded from an earlier altercation, Gunches and an acquaintance loaded him into a car under the pretense of dropping him off at a bus station. But instead of helping him, they drove out into the desert off the Beeline Highway. When Price stepped out of the vehicle, Gunches shot him 4 times, killing him. Gunches pleaded guilty in 2007 to first-degree murder and kidnapping related to Price's death, and was sentenced to death. Unlike most death row inmates, he made no effort to appeal. In fact, Gunches repeatedly filed written requests asking Arizona courts and the governor to expedite his execution, claiming his death sentence was long overdue. For years, he fought to push the state to act on his sentence rather than seeking clemency or appeals. Turn Zero search. On the morning of March 19, 2025, at Arizona State Prison Complex, Florence, Gunches was put to death by lethal injection. At 10:33 a.m. MST, he was pronounced dead. Witnesses said he showed no verbal resistance, and the procedure was completed without major incident. Before his execution, Gunches' final meal was served and confirmed by multiple reporting outlets. He requested and ate double Western bacon cheeseburger, 2 sandwiches, French fries, onion rings, baklava for dessert. Final words: when asked if he wished to make a final statement, Gunches did not speak. Witnesses reported he shook his head as though to say no and offered no verbal final words before the lethal injection began. 9. Wendell Arden Grysom, State, Oklahoma. Age, 56. Year of arrest, 2005. Year of execution, 2025. Wendell Arden Grysom was convicted for the November 3, 2005 home invasion murder of 23-year-old Amber Dawn Matthews in Blaine County, Oklahoma. Prosecutors said Grysom and an accomplice, Jesse Floyd Johns, randomly selected a house where Matthews was visiting with her friend Drew Kopf and her 2 young children. Grysom shot Matthews at close range, killing her, and wounded Kopf multiple times as she tried to flee with the kids. Kopf survived despite serious injuries. Grysom and Johns fled, but were captured after running out of gas and hitching a ride. Grysom was later convicted of first-degree murder, shooting with intent to kill, grand larceny, and unlawful possession of a firearm by a felon. On March 20, 2025, the state of Oklahoma executed Wendell Grysom by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. He was pronounced dead at approximately 10:13 a.m., according to media witnesses. It was Oklahoma's first execution of 2025 and marked the 128th execution in the state's modern capital punishment era. Before his execution, Grysom was served a last meal confirmed by the Oklahoma Department of Corrections: Canadian bacon supreme pizza, pint of vanilla ice cream, pint of Coca-Cola. Wendell Grysom did speak before his execution, offering an apology and expressing remorse to the family of his victim. According to Associated Press reporting and eyewitness accounts, "I apologize to all of you that I've hurt. I regret so much that I've put that hatred in your heart for me. I pray that you all can forgive me, not for my sake, but for your sake." He also stated he was under the influence of drugs and alcohol at the time of the crime and asked for peace and forgiveness. Wendell Grysom, final statement before lethal injection. 10. Edward Thomas James. State: Florida. Age: 63. Year of arrest: 1993. Year of execution: 2025. Edward Thomas James committed one of the most disturbing crimes Florida has ever prosecuted, a crime that unfolded inside a family home and left no room for doubt about its brutality. In September 1993, James was living as a tenant in the home of 58-year-old Betty Dick in Castleberry, Florida. On the night of the attack, Dick's 8-year-old granddaughter, Toni Marie Neuner, was visiting the home. According to court records, James entered the child's bedroom and strangled her until she lost consciousness. Believing she was dead, he sexually assaulted her, then left her on the bed. James then turned his attention to Betty Dick. Prosecutors said he stabbed her more than 20 times, killing her in her own bedroom. After the murders, James stole jewelry, cash, and Dick's car, using the stolen items to fund his escape across multiple states. He was eventually arrested in California after attempting to sell the stolen jewelry. In 1995, James pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder. A Florida jury recommended death, and despite decades of appeals, many centered on mental health claims and sentencing procedures, courts repeatedly upheld the sentence. On March 20, 2025, Florida carried out the execution at Florida State Prison in Rayford. In his final hours, James accepted a last meal, confirmed by the Florida Department of Corrections. It consisted of fried catfish, potato salad, hush puppies, cookies, soda, and coffee. When the moment came for final words, James was asked if he wished to make a statement. His response was brief, direct, and final. "No, I don't." With no further words spoken, the lethal injection was administered. Edward Thomas James was pronounced dead later that evening, closing a case that had haunted one family and Florida's justice system for more than 30 years.